Morning. I'll do the introductions now. We have about 30 seconds anyway, so I think you're okay with starting.
Sure.
All right. This is Joel. He's here locally from Michigan. He's Director of Security Strategy for CBI. He's going to be talking about space shuttle disasters because you said you're the last surviving member?
I am not.
Oh.
I claim no...
All right. He's just a big fan.
I claim no valor in that. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. So I'm Joel. This is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. I love having discussions about many things. Drop me a note and, let's talk about stuff. What I'm going to talk about to you today is actually risk management. That's what this talk is all about. We're going to frame risk management with the Columbia disaster. But risk management is one of those topics. It's not terribly sexy, and it's difficult to talk about. It's very dry. And I know that's a great introduction for a talk, right? You're going to sit here for the next hour hearing that. But at the same time, it winds up being a core of what we do. As security professionals, we are managing risk, whether consciously or not. And there's certain things that I want you to look for when it comes to risk management. And there's certain things I want you to do and be able to do. And I want to see if I can empower you with the tools to be able to address risk in the right way, or at least make the right approach toward it. And we're going to frame it with one of the most well-known space disasters, which is the Columbia. This is actually part 2 of a talk. I did a talk last year on the Space Shuttle Challenger. And the Challenger disaster is a pretty amazing story. There's a lot of drama. There's a lot of story that goes along with that. Columbia, not so much. Columbia is one of these things where it's pretty much, yep, what happened, and we moved on in the space program. So very interesting. A lot of similarities between the two, but some differences as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of bring you up to speed before we actually talk about Columbia. And here's some statistics on the space program. Very interesting stuff. 833, the total number of crew members on all 135 space shuttle missions. So we sent 833 people into space just using the space shuttle program, right? That's a lot of people. And really, when you consider how risky it is to send a human into space, it's pretty amazing that we actually haven't had more fatalities than we have. NASA, in the entire history of manned spaceflight, has lost 17 astronauts, and I'll tell you about those in a minute. 789 is the number of astronauts who have returned to Earth on a NASA shuttle. Some of these actually went up in Russian Soyuz capsules, but came back on a space shuttle, and that's mostly the International Space Station. Columbia's primary mission, or at least it was retooled later in the program, was to support the efforts of the International Space Station and to bring the components to the ISS to build it out, as well as Space Lab and other science components of the ISS. So it was a critical player in building out the International Space Station and getting people to and from and equipment to and from that facility. 355, the actual number of individual astronauts and cosmonauts who have flown on the space shuttle, right, breaks down to 306 men and 49 women, hailing from 16 different countries. So a pretty large program, right, encompasses a lot of breadth and, basically paints with a broad brush. 234, the number of days the space shuttle astronauts spent at the ISS between 1998 and 2011 when it was being constructed. So for that roughly 13-year period, we had space shuttles. In addition to Columbia, we had Atlantis, and actually Challenger started a little bit with that too. And I think Discovery, if I'm not mistaken, helped build out the ISS. All right, what are you giving me? Are you giving me errors? 180, the total number of satellites and other payloads, including components for the International Space Station deployed by the NASA space shuttles. And 135, total number of NASA space shuttle missions that will have flown between 1981 and 2011. So that time period between 1981 and 2011 is the time of the Space Transportation System, the STS, which we've known as the Space Shuttle. 14 of the 17 lives that were lost to manned spaceflight happened during that period within this program. So while 17 is not a large number, when you start to break it down and look at it in context, it turns out that the shuttle program was a lot more risky and a lot more lethal than any of the other programs that we've been involved in that have included manned spaceflight. First fatalities we had were the Apollo 1 crew. This is the crew of the Apollo 1. This is Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee. What happened was they, in January 27th, 1967, they were conducting a test in the capsule on the launch pad when a fire broke out. The fire immediately consumed pretty much everything aboard. The astronauts were burned alive. They had no time to escape. When they did the accident investigation, okay, this is in 1967, they found several causes. Number one, there was an ignition source, probably related to wiring. They found some stripped wiring and things that were bare, and vulnerable plumbing carrying a combustible and corrosive coolant that helped accelerate the fire once it started. Another cause was they decided to go with a pure oxygen atmosphere rather than an oxygen-nitrogen balance, and this caused the fire to spread very, very quickly. A cabin sealed with a hatch cover that could not quickly be removed under high pressure. So when the capsule was pressurized, the hatch could not be easily removed or popped. An extensive distribution of combustible materials in the cabin. This is the last time that you'll see anything like paper or cardboard in any kind of manned spaceflight mission. And inadequate emergency preparedness. And this is the risk management part. Rescue or medical assistance and crew escape. They did not have the right preparedness, the right plans for these astronauts, and thus loss of life. So this changed NASA. And they went through a couple of different things. The first thing they did was the NASA director at the time told everybody to go back to their blackboards and write the words tough and competent on their blackboards. And what that was meant to say was, we will accept nothing less than perfection from now on. We will never lose another human life because we will be tough and we will be competent, and we will never compromise what these statements are. They also built on the Project Mercury ground rule. The Project Mercury ground rule was a rule that was set back in the Mercury days when we first started talking about spaceflight at all. And effectively, what that said is, we will not ever send a human into space unless all parties agree that it is safe to send a human into space. So everyone has to be in agreement. There can be no dissent. That's the hard and fast rule, the Project Mercury ground rule. It is inviolate. Okay? So they said, these things will be the future of spaceflight for us. We'll be tough. We'll be competent. We will obey the Project Mercury ground rule. Fast forward 19 years. This is the crew of the Shuttle Columbia. This is the Challenger. Now, the Challenger was a pretty unique mission. It was the first time we were sending a civilian into space. So Krista McAuliffe, who's in the back row there, is a teacher who was tapped to, she went through the space program. She was training as an astronaut. And on the inaugural flight, when they flew up, a number of things happened. But most significantly, the solid fuel rocket booster twisted. There was an O-ring that failed. And basically, the shuttle exploded. The accident causes, on the morning of the flight, it was too cold, beyond tolerances. In fact, this takes place in Cape Canaveral, Florida, and that morning there are actual pictures of the launch pad with icicles hanging off the launch pad, right, in Florida. This is actually a year where they lost an orange crop. It was a really, really unusual time for Florida. But there was ice on the launch pad. There was an O-ring that was meant to maintain a seal during flight, and it failed, mostly because of the coldness. It couldn't handle the temperature tolerances of the coldness. It allowed hot gases to escape. These gases ignited, caused a chain reaction. The two fuel tanks on the main booster basically crashed into each other. Those fuel mixtures mixed. That's what caused the explosion. Okay? But if you look, there's a cause on there that says massive failures in communication. Really, really important. And this is a topic I'm going to hit with you pretty hard. Because when it comes to managing risk, communication is key. It is the answer, right? It is the answer. But there were communication failures all through the Challenger pipeline. We had engineers who were communicating to management what they thought was correct information and may not have been. We had managers who were not consuming the information correctly. We had an issue where the flight director of the shuttle program, who's sitting in Houston, who is the one person that has the authority to scrub a launch, did not get critical information at the last minute that would have resulted in them scrubbing the launch. Massive communication failures. And they violated the Project Mercury ground rule. Because the night before the shuttle launched, the contractors at Morton Thiokol had a call with NASA and said, we don't think it's safe. We don't think you should fly. And basically NASA management bullied them into saying, it's okay, let's fly. Everybody signs off on it, and off we go. And there's a whole story behind that. If you're interested, you can look up my talk from last year or come talk to me about it. I'll tell you all about it. It is a fascinating story. So what was interesting about this review versus the Apollo 1 review is the Apollo 1 review is an internal review. This one was actually an external review. The Rogers Commission was put together by President Reagan to get people together to figure out what happened. Why did we have this shuttle failure? And as a result, NASA created a new Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance. So they put some safeguards in place to say we will never allow this to happen again. We've had 3 astronauts in the Apollo die. We've had 7 astronauts in the Challenger, 10 astronauts. We will not have another human loss of life. Again, fast forward 19 years. This is the crew of the Columbia. I went backwards, didn't I? Yes, I'm sorry. So 17 years later, the Columbia missions are flying, right? So what actually happened in the Columbia? So now let's talk about what the Columbia. We'll use this as a framework for our discussion. During the launch of STS-107, which was one of the shuttle flights for Columbia, a piece of foam broke away from the external tank and it struck the left wing area where there was a thermal protection system, which is basically there to help with reentry. When you reentry, you get really, really hot because there's friction from the atmosphere that's building up. The thermal protection system is specifically there to protect you against burnup on reentry. Okay? This piece of foam, and when I say foam, I'm talking about like the stuff that you buy in the can, the spray foam that you spray on stuff that expands, very, very similar stuff, broke away, hit the left wing of the orbiter. This actually created a hole in the wing. And once the integrity of the thermal protection system is compromised, it's over. There's nothing you can do. Okay? 12 days later, after they had completed their ISS mission, they re-entered the atmosphere, the structure destabilized, and it burned up on re-entry. All hands were lost when the shuttle broke apart. So the cause of this particular disaster was this piece of foam that struck the thermal protection layer and injured it. Okay? That's the physical cause. But here's the problem. This is some of the worst parts of the story. In every case that happened, NASA engineers knew that it could happen because they were employing risk management practices that showed these were possible and in some cases probable, highly probable scenarios. So they were doing their due diligence with risk management. They were actually identifying the problems and saying, yes, these problems were identified, but they had poor follow-up, right? So the risk management practice or process was incomplete. They were able to do some things, but they weren't able to execute all things. Risk management is very complex. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's stuff that you really have to pay attention to, okay? Apollo suffered from being gung-ho about the schedule, and they blocked out the problems. Even though the problems were identified, they said, we shouldn't have a pure oxygen atmosphere, and they really should have a balance. The management said, no, we got to stick to the schedule. We'll accept that as a risk and move on, right? For Challenger, it was all about getting that civilian in space. We have a civilian. We've had media attention on this. NASA does not fail, right? That was the big thing for them. Kind of the same thing, sticking to the schedule. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board concluded that NASA had really failed to learn many of the lessons from the Challenger. So the real tragedy of Columbia is we'd already seen it happen with Challenger. It's a little bit different with Apollo and Challenger because the situations were not the same. But when you really start to look at what was happening between Challenger and Columbia, now they look exactly the same 17 years apart. And it really is a tragedy. In particular, the agency had not set up a truly independent office for safety and oversight. The CAIB felt that in this area, NASA's response to the Rogers Commission didn't meet the Commission's intent, right? So the Rogers Commission, after Challenger, said, create this Office of Safety. They created the Office of Safety, but it didn't fulfill what the intent was. The CAIB believed that the causes of institutional failure responsible for the Challenger had not been fixed, and the same flawed decision-making processes that resulted in the Challenger accident was also responsible for Columbia. So we didn't learn from our mistakes. And that's a really important thing. We have to be able to learn from our mistakes. And risk management, if done properly, allows us to do that. It allows us to see what our previous mistakes were, our previous risks were, and tie them into what we're doing now so we don't repeat them. And it's an important part. The point of this story is that it emulates real life. All of these stories, they emulate real life. And so we want to learn from these stories and not repeat them. So let's look at these problems, see if we can learn from the failures. The very first lesson, again, is communicate. Communication is paramount. This will make or break you. And I'm talking to you about risk management, but I will say communication will make or break you in information security, right? It's the single best tool that we have that is applied the worst, right? Communication is terrible in InfoSec. Sometimes we can't even talk to each other, right? Let alone talk to managers or people who need to hear us. You know, Johnny was giving his keynote and he was talking about how there's so much infighting in information security right now. And it's because we're not talking to each other, right? You know, we're listening to the voices that are loud and not the voices that have reason and sound things behind them. And that's got to stop. So communication is the first thing. You have to be good with communication. And you don't need to be a good communicator. You just need to know how to tap into a communication chain and make it work for you. What does poor communication look like? Right? The organization consists of regular and contract personnel with different reporting structures. Okay? So this causes problem. There's not necessarily a singular goal organizationally when you have a great mix of people that can be followed. The employees cover an array of disciplines and are dispersed across various locations. In today's day and age, we have the ability to immediately jump on video conferencing and do things instantaneously. But in the days of the space shuttle flights, this was not well done, right? And so you've got people in disparate locations who need to communicate. Maybe they're doing it by telephone. Maybe they're even doing it by video conference in a very rudimentary way. Or maybe they're mostly doing it by mail, right? So things are arriving too late and being sent out too late for people to really respond properly to communication. Organizational complexity has evolved over time, and business directions have contributed to that complexity, right? So every time the business says we want to do this new thing, we want to add this feature, we want to tap into this market, what happens to complexity? It goes up. And the various centers involved with have different points of focus, right? Causes divergence. So you've got departments that have their own goals and their own things that they want to do, and we're not necessarily working together. We need better communication so we can work together. And then frequent reorganizations. We want to be more efficient. And so the company says we're going to reorganize, we're going to reform, we're going to move these types of roles from here to here, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Everything here is happening at NASA in the 2000s. What I would like to ask you right now is, can you read anything on this slide and say, that applies to me today in 2017? I'm betting that it does. I'm betting most of them do, right? You're fighting the same battles that they fought in the 2000s, in the 1990s, in the 1980s, in the 1970s. We're doing this thing to ourselves, repeating it over and over and over, and it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. Why are we not learning? We know organizational insulation causes problems, so why do we allow it? You have to be brave. You have to be able to reach across the aisle and communicate. It's so important. I can't stress it enough, right? So effectively what's happening is over time, a pattern of ineffective communication has resulted. It's leaving risks improperly defined, problems unreported, and the concerns unexpressed, right? And these are all significant contributors of lack of communication. The CAIB, the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, found that the current shuttle program was too insular, right? They were sitting there with their heads down, with their tunnel vision, focused on their one priority, which was whatever assigned to them, and there was not a lot of cross-talk or cross-traffic, and it was causing problems. These are engineers who are doing this. These are engineers engineering systems that are supposed to work together. It's kind of have the same thing in automotive today, right? The automotive manufacturers are building systems that are all designed to work together. Is there anybody who works here in automotive who has seen stuff come together and then it just doesn't work? I've seen that. Right? It's crazy. How do you make that work? Who is responsible? And when you ask those questions, who's responsible for the overall process, for the overall program, making it work? You just get a bunch of blank stares looking around the room. It's bad. That's got to stop. There's a potential for conflicts between contractual and programmatic goals. This may not necessarily apply to you specifically, but it certainly does if you're involved in something like manufacturing. You know, in this case, you've got about a 60-40 split. 60% of the employees working on the shuttle programs are government employees, about 40% are contractors. They have different goals. The contractor's goal is to fulfill the contract. The employee's goal is to fill the program goal. These are not necessarily aligned, and nobody is responsible for bringing them together to make them aligned. There are deficiencies in problem and waiver tracking systems. How do we track problems, and how do we track the exceptions to those problems? Definite deficiencies. We'll actually look at a couple of them here. And the exchange of communication across the shuttle program hierarchy structurally limited, both upward and downward, and really laterally. So even within their own silos, they're having problem getting information up from the floor to the management and information from the management down to the floor. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Right? Are you living this? I certainly have, and it's a terrible existence, which means we have to think about it differently to address it, to do better. Right? So there's this thing in risk management that we call a risk register. And a risk register is basically a list of your risks. And it lists them out, and it says, this is what my risk is, this is the impact of that risk, these are the things that trigger that risk, and this is what happens if we don't do something about that risk, effectively. That's what a risk register does. Right? There's really good things with risk registers that'll happen. You can catalog the risks present in your organization, you can categorize them, you can prioritize them, you can assign them, you can track them. There's all kinds of great things you can do. But there is an inherent problem with risk registers. And that is, we become reliant on them. Rather than becoming a tool for us to use in managing risk, they become the Bible under which we govern whatever we're doing. And that's bad. This is exactly what happened at NASA. It's exactly what will happen to you if you fall into this trap. Things like ritualistic decision making, right? I can't make a decision unless I check the risk register. And this guides what all my decisions are. So you can't think properly if it's not in terms of whatever that risk register is telling you. Illusion of control basically means you think you have your handle around it, but you really don't, right? Or the map is not the territory. This is my favorite one. This is where, hey, we've got our list of risks. This is all the risks in our organization ever, and we're great. Probably not, right? Probably not. Probably this is a tiny cosm of the risk you're actually dealing with, and your real risk is out here, and between this and this is where your problem is, and if nobody has sight into that, you will have issues. Okay? Exact same problem happened with NASA and happened with Columbia. So let's talk about Columbia. They had a thing called a critical items list. And on that list, they had 5,396 individual shuttle hazards that were listed. That is a massive amount of data. Okay? It's probably kept in a spreadsheet, like Excel 1.0, right? So if you have something like this, that's great. What do you do with it? How do you, as somebody who wants to manage risk or tie risk into other things or do different things, how do you manage a list that's this long? It's a very difficult equation. Of those risks, 4,222 of them, 78% of the total risks were deemed criticality 1-1R. A criticality 1-1R means we will have a loss of the orbiter or the crew. So 78% of the risks that were identified resulted in loss of life or loss of the orbiter. That's huge. That's massive. Okay? And keep in mind, this is over the course of the shuttle program. So we're not just necessarily talking about Columbia. We're talking about the entire shuttle spaceflight program. That's enormous. And we only lost 14 people? Like, that just blows my mind. Of those critical risks, 3,223 of them, or 76%, had exceptions or waivers. In other words, they said, yeah, we'll accept that. That's a risk we can accept. And they hadn't gone back and reviewed them for at least 10 years. So again, you can make lists of risk. You can create a risk management register or risk register. You can have all this great stuff and say, oh, this is my risk. This is it. But if you're not putting diligence around the process of managing what that thing is, it's just a piece of paper. It's not going to do you any good at all. All it's going to do is point the blame when something bad happens and say, yeah, we didn't do our jobs, right? Which is what this is saying. It's terrible. More than 36% of the waivers, yeah, they hadn't been approved in 10 years, right? It's crazy. So from the CAIB report, the shuttle's thermal protection system was actually on the critical items list. So the fact that the fragility of that system being prone to being deconstructed due to outside forces like debris strikes was well known, well documented, was on the list and accepted as a risk, and was what ultimately led to the deaths of 7 people. Okay? That's an important thing to understand. We identified the risk. We maybe even threat modeled it. We saw that there was an impact. We saw what the impact would be. We saw what the result was. And then we took it anyway. What's going on in people's minds, right? The first thing I think of is, why didn't anybody see this? Well, it turns out there's a reason for that. We'll talk about that. Moving into lesson 2, which is speak up. Now, this is where I'm going to put you out of your comfort zone, because you have to speak up. Whatever it is, you have to be brave. You have to be honest. You have to address these things head on. If management isn't listening, you got to say that. You're not listening. Okay? But you can't just speak up. You have to have things that are behind you helping you with your argument. You have to have data. A risk register is a good thing to have in this particular case, because you can show, look, we identified this risk. This is what the impact is. This is what the result's going to be. Maybe we've got a threat model. We modeled it and we saw that if we do this and this and this, these things are going to happen. So when it comes to protecting data in your organization, you can have these things that help you, but you have to speak up. People have to know. And here's the thing. Your message has to contain business imperatives. You have to be able to tie those risks back to problems in the business. Because if it's just problems with security, nobody cares. That's the sad reality of our industry. Nobody cares. In a manager's mind, you're responsible for security. Don't make me responsible for it. So you have to have business imperatives in there. How does this impact the business? If we don't protect this data, and we can see that this data has value, and if that value gets out, it will cost us this much in compliance fines or in reputational damage or what have you, it's going to fall on deaf ears. So you have to identify, how does this impact the business? That's number 1 when you're speaking up. Number 2 is seek to be a trusted advisor. Be like, look, I'm not Chicken Little. I'm not saying the sky is falling. What I'm telling you is we are running with a massive level of risk. And if you're willing to accept that risk, that's great. I just need you to be aware of it. Those are important conversations. That's what you want to say. And that's all you're doing. You're not taking responsibility for the risk. You're saying, I'm pointing this out. I need you to be aware of it because it's really important that you do in your decision making. So when you make the next decision, it's there. I guarantee you, if you plant this seed early and often, it will bear fruit. Something will happen in a manager's mind when they're like, oh, all right, yeah, we're gonna tap into this new market and we're gonna do this new thing with this product, and then it's gonna go, oh wait, that security person was telling me something. What was it? That's all you need. That's all you need to happen is for them to stop and think. They may still charge ahead, but if you can get them to stop and think once, you can get them to do it again and again and again. It's an iterative process. You just need to keep hitting it over and over and over as much as you can. Get them to stop, get them to think, talk to them. This is your risk. This is how it damages your business. Okay? And frame the risk in context too. That's a really important thing. Very often I see risk reports that are written, and maybe they're written long form, maybe they're on registers, however they're delivered, but they don't always have the right context around them. So for instance, look at something like Equifax. It's highly unlikely that your organization operates exactly like Equifax. So if you're going to make a comparison to what happened to Equifax to what can happen to you, you need to put it in the right context and say, all right, operationally, we don't have the same parameters. We don't maintain the same data sets. We don't have the same infrastructures, whatever you can do to help pull it in context. But you can say anecdotally, we can see that this happened to this company. We're going to assume things work that way. So we're using that context to create our threat model and report this as risk. Can you see how all this is working together? Right? These are really important things to be able to talk to managers about. And risk contexts are things like business context, financial context, personnel context. You can say honestly, and you should, again, be brave, be honest, be like, look, if we don't do this and we put this at risk, people will leave. And if people leave, that's going to cause more risk, right? It cranks up the risk equation. So you can talk about that stuff. Don't think just because you're an information security person that all you can talk about is information security. No. Talk about risk. There's a risk to personnel. There's a risk to finance. There's a risk to business. There's a risk to technology. Talk about that. You don't have to be a subject matter expert on everything. That's not required, right? As an advisor, that is not required. I'm a consultant. I get paid to consult with clients on things I don't know about all the time. But what they pay me for is the trust that I can bring to the table to say, I can find that for you. I can discover what that is. I can bring it to you in a way that you can understand it better. You can do that same thing. You should do that same thing. Okay? The thing about the foam shedding issue is that it was a constant problem across all of the shuttle flights. From the first flight to the last flight, they had foam shedding every single time, which is why it was captured as a risk, right? And it's why it was put on the criticality list to say we've got a problem here. But it was accepted by management. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. Basically, the damage caused by debris occurred on every space flight. Most missions had the insulating foam shed during ascent, which they cataloged. And with each successful landing, NASA engineers and managers regarded the foam shedding as inevitable. This is the trap. And either unlikely to jeopardize safety or simply an acceptable risk. That's the thing. When it happens over and over and over, what happens? It becomes normal. So now we have a very high-risk activity that could result in loss of life happening constantly, and it happens so often we just accept it as normal. Yep, that's normal. Until somebody dies. Then it's a problem. That's the trap. And you got to be really, really careful about it. The original design for foam loss was considered a dangerous problem. When the designers first did it, they said, look, if we're going to use this foam, there's going to be problems with it, and we think that it's going to complicate things and cause some serious issues. Parts of the thermal protection system are so vulnerable to impact that lightly pressing your thumbnail into them left a mark. Right? It was extremely fragile material. And one of the flight directors who helped with the shuttle design and had gone up in a couple of test flights made a comment where he said, I thought when I was flying it that I was surrounded by inches and inches of this material, and it wound up being about a layer an eighth of an inch thick. And if I had known that, I never would have flown. Right? So, assumptions too. Assumptions will kill you. Make sure they're in your risk. The problem is NASA management rushed to the conclusion that the strikes weren't causing safety flight issues, even though it was happening all the time. And they stifled the discussions of possible dangers of the foam shedding and the strikes. And that is an important thing. Your management will try to stifle your discussion if you identify something that is a key business item for them that is going to impact that business. They're going to try to shout it down. They're going to try to push it down. You have to persevere. You have to persevere. And the way to persevere is data. It's not going to be your voice. It's not going to be you stomping, yelling, throwing a fit. It's going to be all the data you can possibly manage to get together on that thing to show, here it all is. These are the things that we're talking about. These are important things, right? Data is your friend at that point. The other thing is management wants us to be brief, right? Has anybody ever put together a deck of slides for executives or boards and said, you get 2 slides in the presentation? Wolf, I know. You've definitely done this, right? All the time I would face this. All right, the board is committed to security. We're going to create a deck on security. You get 2 slides of the 75 slides that are in that deck. But we're committed. We're going to talk about it. So how do I take something as complicated as risk management and all the risks that exist in my organization, my list of 5,000 risks, and condense that to 2 PowerPoint slides? How do I do that? I don't know, right? I pick the most important stuff, I guess. And I do that? I'm not sure. It all depends. The initial damage assessment briefing prepared for the mission evaluation room was cut down considerably in order to fit the time schedule. And even then, it was 40 minutes long, and they said, nope, go back and do it again. So they got it down to 3 slides, a 3-minute discussion topic for the mission management team. So is management getting the proper information? Absolutely they're not. Here is my argument to that, however. While the specific forum they picked to communicate that information was limited, that is not the only time you can have these discussions. And you should be having these discussions all the time. You should be always talking about risk. Risk, all the time. You know, to the point where they're just like, oh God, stop talking to me about this. And you're like, nope, gonna talk about it some more. Here's my data. Okay? Have them always thinking about this as a topic of conversation so you can engage. When it comes to the official meeting, you might have to condense that down. I get that, and it's important. But at the same time, don't let that only be your avenue of communication. Okay? And remember, don't just talk within your little circle. Talk outside your circle. Go to human resources. Talk to them about their risk. Hey, you guys manage PII data, right? How do you do that? When somebody comes in and signs a form, what do you do with the paper? Right? When somebody calls in and they're doing a background check or a reference check, what kinds of information do you allow them to talk about? Like, just chat them up. Buy them donuts, do something. Get that conversation started. The more friends you make across departments, the better you will be positioned when you need to have that conversation when it counts. Okay? Tapes of the STS 107 management sessions revealed a noticeable rush by the meeting's leader to the preconceived bottom line that there was no safety of flight issue. Remember? Project Mercury ground rule. He was trying to get all parties to agree, we're good to go, and push them there. If this is happening to you and you have an inviolate rule, such as a compliance rule, stand your ground. Do not allow that to be rushed. And if it is rushed, you need to somehow get an official way to bring that back to the table. Whether it's, give me a line in the meeting minutes that say we need to discuss this later, or something. You need to protect yourself when it comes to this. Because again, risk management, we're trying to bring the information to light. We're trying to get people to understand it. Understand that there is risk here. At the end of the day, you're not responsible for what they do, but you are responsible for what you bring to the table. Very important concept. Yep. Sure. Okay, so let me just rephrase. So the question is, in the management mission meetings, was it something that they discussed every time? It was not. What this is the Columbia Accident Investigation Board went back and listened to tapes of the meetings, and the comment by the investigation board was, we can obviously tell that the management is rushing these issues to get through them, and their presumption was to get through any no-fly safety issues. So yes, the engineers were talking about it all the time, according to the engineers, right? It's all hearsay at this point. But in the accident investigation document, which, by the way, this is all public information. You can look this up. I have read the Rogers Commission report. I've read the CAIB multiple times, both times. They're absolutely fascinating reads. Ton of technical detail, stuff you're just not going to understand. That's fine. But getting to the real meat of what they're talking about here is amazing. And I'll talk about Diane Vaughn in a little bit too, which will help frame all these discussions. So from the CAIB, the mission management team participants felt pressured to remain quiet unless the decision turned to their particular area of technological or system expertise, and even then to be brief. Anybody in this situation? Right? When I want your opinion, I'll ask for it. Kind of thing? No, not acceptable. I'm sorry. If I am your trusted advisor, I am going to advise you. And maybe it means I talk out of school. Maybe it means I talk out of turn. Maybe it means I talk about things I don't understand, but I understand there's risk. And maybe I don't know what that risk is, but I got to bring it to the table so we can get people together and we can define what it is so you can make a better decision. When I empower you to make better decisions, your business prospers. That is your role. It's not as sexy as poppin' 0 days, right? But it's a core of what we do, especially as trusted advisors. I am going to empower you, Mr. Manager or Mrs. Manager, I'm equal opportunity, right? To make the best decision you possibly can for your business and have your business thrive. Use those words. They're powerful words, right? So also from the CAIB, organizations with strong safety cultures generally acknowledge that a leader's best response to unanimous consent is to play devil's advocate and encourage an exhaustive debate. So this is what you should do. Try to play the devil's advocate. Even when you're convinced of your position, try to take a contrary position or get somebody else to take a contrary position. Really important. Really, really important. Now, this is one of those things that has to be done with tact and, perhaps stepped lightly with. You can't be a devil's advocate and, be willing to fight out of the gate. That's not where you want to be. But you definitely want to pose things that are contrary to the group consensus, especially when there's group consensus. What's that? There was a movie it was World War Z, where they talked about this rule in Israel, the rule of 12 or whatever. I looked it up. It's not quite. They movieized it a little bit. But effectively what it says is, if 11 people agree to something, it is the 12th person's responsibility to disagree. And that is for exactly this reason. To cause debate, to make sure that we are not missing something. Right? That's what we have to do. We have to make sure we're not missing something. Be the devil's advocate. So, lesson 3, advocating for a risk-based culture. And this is super important. The past predicts the future. Okay? For both Challenger and Columbia, pre-flight safety checks were performed every single time. They performed pre-flight checks on every shuttle mission, an exhaustive list of pre-flight checks. Does this check out? Does this check out? Does this check out? And if any of those checks failed, the flights did not fly. And to be fair, there were flights that did not fly. Challenger 25, which was the one that exploded, actually had, I think, somewhere between 5 and 7 failed starts before it actually launched because pre-flight safety checks failed. Okay? So these were good. These were good things that they were using. Their pre-flight safety checklists were effective. The checks resulted in a go, no-go status for each flight, and Challenger and Columbia flew multiple times without an incident. But here's the thing. Every single flight of Challenger experienced the exact O-ring failure that led to Challenger 25 blowing up. Every single flight of the shuttle shed foam that caused the Columbia to burn up on reentry. So while the pre-flight safety checks were effective and they were awesome, what they were not doing was taking the time in between missions to say, did we have any failures that might contribute to a future failure? They weren't doing the proper analysis, which again is risk management in a nutshell. They weren't looking at what was between the flights to do it. Now, they were capturing the information. Don't get me wrong. It's not like they weren't doing anything. They were capturing it all. They just didn't do anything with it. So it was all on a list, all on a risk register sitting somewhere. You know, a document on somebody's desk doing nothing. With this, one of the things that we can definitely see when we start to look at the activities of the pre-flight checklists and the area in between the checklists, it was very, very apparent that the flight schedule was one of the most important things that they were to maintain, right? So in even doing some of this analysis, it might have caused them problems because it could have pushed out future missions. And these are very, very expensive things. To scrub a flight launch is really expensive. So, you know, what's the impetus for people to never fail and to, you know, always want to maintain their flight schedule? They're going to cut some corners. They're going to do some things. It's going to be problematic. So this is an actual checklist from the in-between flights that they did. The STS is the mission number, and the comments are kind of what happened. You can kind of see on this. I got to take my glasses off actually. The first one is, there's lots of debris damage. 300 tiles had to be replaced from STS-1. So the very first flight of that mission, they had to replace some thermal tiles. The first known left bipod ramp shedding event, which is actually what caused the Columbia to be struck in the left wing. The two I highlighted in purple, actually, were only discovered after the CAIB asked them to go through and look at their checklists again. So these were actually discovered in an investigation after the Columbia had exploded. Right? Wow. Nobody caught this the first time around, and they're both foam shedding events. They were both foam shedding events that actually led to the problem with Columbia. So that was in the board's mind too. They were like, why did it take us to tell you to look for you to find this? What's going on with this? Something is wrong. We've got something wrong with our culture where people aren't thinking the right way. They're not doing the right things. They knew the monitoring of the tile damage was inadequate. Space flight personnel, they testified that actually in the hearings. But the clear trends could be more readily identified if they were doing this in-between monitoring. But they never made the improvements. They never did it. But they knew. They knew it was a problem. Right? You may be in the same situation. You may know that there's a problem, but you're not really doing anything about it. Stop not doing anything about it and do something about it. Okay? Document at least. Try to make some correlations. Try to tie things together. Try to get it to where it makes more sense than going, I think there's something here. You know, I'm scratching my head. I know there's something. I can't quite make it out. Put those puzzle pieces together. So Diane Vaughan is an American sociologist, and she coined an excellent term called the normalization of deviance. And basically what this means is when things are deviant, when they're out of true, and they happen over a course of time, we accept them as being normal, right? So we're normalizing the deviance. Processes become corrupted without anybody noticing, and the really weird phenomenon is the acceptance of deviation becomes the norm, and people in the organization cannot see it. And it's really strange. You work with it for so long, it just becomes normal, and you can't see that it's actual deviance, that it's actual risk behavior, especially when it's a high-level risk that's accepted. That's just the way we do business, I've heard, right? Yeah, we just do business that way. No, you can't do business that way, right? If it's a high risk, you need to have a plan in place to treat that risk. You need to have something, okay? And this is why consultants get paid really big dollars. Consultants come into organizations and, when I walk into a customer, I have no baggage. I don't care what political things are going on. I don't care who's fighting with who. I don't care who's sleeping with who. I don't care. I come in, I look at the issue, and I say, this is your problem. And it's tough love, and sometimes they don't like to hear it, and sometimes they resist it. They go, no, that can't be the problem. Well, I can tell you that I came in as a third-party observer. I have absolutely no ties to you, and this is what I see. And this happens. So it's this weird phenomenon that happens in organizations, and it happens to everybody. Diane Vaughn actually wrote a book that examines the Shuttle, the Challenger. She did a little work on Columbia too, but she's most well known for writing a book on Challenger. I should have put the name of the book up there, but if you're interested, look up Diane Vaughn and Challenger. You can get the ebook. It's really fascinating when she talks about how these things broke down, and you read the whole thing and you're like, yep, that's me. That's the world I'm living in right now. Right? They had budget issues. So in 2000, which was almost 3 years before the Columbia incident and roughly 13 years after the Challenger, NASA presented to Congress its budget. And they said, hey, we're going to have this budget. In that was this proposal called the Space Shuttle Safety Upgrade Initiative. The initiative sought to create a proactive upgrade program that was going to keep the shuttle flying safely to 2012 and beyond, and meet the agency commitments for goals in human access to space. The plan called for the upgrades to be completed by 2008, and apparently I'm running Bluetooth, which I didn't know, so whoever's trying to pair with me, stop. So they presented this program to Congress, and they said, hey, we're gonna do all these safety upgrades and stuff, and Congress was like, oh, okay, that's cool. Here's the thing. Every proposed safety upgrade, with very few exceptions, was either not approved or was deferred. This is the thing that drives me the most crazy. The Spaceflight Leadership Council accepted the upgrades with a stipulation only as long as as financially feasible. Okay? So in other words, in the words of the commission, funding a safety upgrade in order to fly safely and then canceling it for budgetary reasons makes the concept of mission safety rather hollow. Okay? So sure, we're going to perform all those upgrades to promote safety if we can afford them. Let me rephrase this for you. Funding an information security upgrade in order to protect data and then canceling it for budgetary reasons makes the concept of data protection rather hollow. Would anybody disagree with this statement? Now, don't get me wrong. I was in management a long time. Budgets are important. All right? They are what make businesses run. A business can't spend all of its money, and they certainly can't spend all of its money on information security and be expected to thrive. I get that. We all have to deal with budgetary constraints. However, when you can directly tie a risk of budget reduction to danger to data that is critical data the business needs to survive, there should be no question that you have the budget that you need to protect that, because the business is in danger. That's what something like a risk register and having those conversations is going to do for you, and advocating for that risk-based culture. Getting people to understand that, okay, maybe I can't have my blinky box. That's fine. We have to put protections around this data, because if this gets out, we're done, right? It's going to hurt us so bad, we're not going to be able to recover, or the recovery is going to take so long, it's going to cost this much money. Have those conversations. This is what you should be thinking about, using these lessons. When your budgets are cut or funding is pulled, identify it as a risk. Oh, they cut the budget on this, add it to the risk register. That's okay. That's valid. That's what you should be doing. So learn these lessons. Communicate, communicate, communicate. I can't stress it enough. Communication is paramount. Tantamount. Whatever the apex is, right? It's that thing. You have to be at the top communicating all the time. Okay? Speak out on risks regardless of your expertise. Do not be afraid to talk about risks to personnel. Do not be afraid to talk about risks to your particular industry, even if you're not an industry expert. Don't be afraid to talk about risks to technology, even if you're not a technology expert, right? It's okay. You can talk about those things and say, look, there's risk present here. We need to identify it. Maybe I'm not the right person. We got to find somebody. Let's find it. Let's get it addressed, and you figure it out. What are we going to do about it? At the very least, I, as your trusted advisor, need to empower you, Mrs. Manager, to make the best decision you possibly can in the interest of the business. And then advocate for that risk management culture. We have to have an organizational culture that accepts risk management, that allows us to talk about risk, that doesn't shout us down, that doesn't say the schedule is the most important thing. Anybody work for a development company where the schedule is the thing? We got to make releases. We got to make releases. We got to make releases. I get that. I understand it. I understand releases are important, but I also understand the cost of redoing a release 3 releases after it's been released. Okay? And I can identify that as a risk and go, if you want to run with this risk, that's up to you. But that risk impacts this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And the funny thing about risk is the more you add, the more it compounds, the greater it gets. There's no such thing as having parallel risks and maintaining the same risk level. Okay? Compounding risk is the worst thing that can happen to you. Compounding interest is awesome. Little finance lesson for you. When a program agrees to spend less money or accelerate a schedule beyond what engineers and program managers think is reasonable, a small amount of overall risk is added. These little pieces of risk add up until the managers are no longer aware of the total program risk. In fact, they're gambling, and little by little, NASA was accepting more and more risk in order to stay on schedule, and you're doing the same thing, I guarantee it. So it is somebody's job. If you have a PMO, it is certainly part of their job, but it is your job as a security advisor to point this out. The more we add these little risks, the greater the risk compounds. And we're in danger of losing sight of the overall risk because of it. It's an extremely important concept. And this encapsulates everything that you need to do. Okay? I need to be aware of it. I need to understand how it impacts one another. I need to be aware of the overall risk and how it compounds. And I need to be able to communicate that out. Okay? Risk-based decision-making is hard. So here's the thing about Columbia. And this is the real tragedy of the story. Within minutes of the problem, so roughly 82 seconds after flight, the debris struck the wing. The wing had a hole. The engineers started to look at the problem because they had some cameras that showed them there was some damage. And within hours, they knew the shuttle would not survive re-entry. There was no scenario that allowed that to happen. They entertained a couple of things. Can we send up Atlantis to rescue them? Can we do a spacewalk to repair it? Right? They investigated these things, and the board found that even though they entertained these ideas, those ideas would have been actually even more risky. And so they had a problem. The problem was they're going up for a mission. Their mission is doomed. In 12 days, what do we do? Do we tell them or do we not tell them? Here's the quote from the Director of Mission Operations. You know, there's nothing we can do about the damage to the thermal protection system. If it's been damaged, it's probably better not to know. I think the crew would rather not know. Don't you think it would be better for them to have a successful flight and die unexpectedly during entry than to stay in orbit knowing there was nothing could be done or until the air ran out? That is the hardest decision anybody could ever make, and they opted not to tell them. So for 12 days, people knew. They knew what was going to happen, and all they could do was watch. And that's because they didn't properly manage their risk. Now, you can say I'm being dramatic, and I am, because I'm a thespian and I love drama, right? But here's what I'm going to say. Although we're talking about the loss of human life and spaceflight is very, very risky, when you have things like medical IoT, we are putting patients' lives at risk. And security is a strong part of medical IoT, and it needs to be stronger. And we need to put forward these conversations and these risk-based threat models and show that we're not just talking in a vacuum, that information security is foundational. And if we are going to eventually one day riddle our body with sensors, because that is the direction we're going in, we will have sensors all over us, in us, outside of us, around us. Information security is a key part of making that happen. And an executive who says to me, if I spend $1 on security, that's $1 I can't spend on patient care, My counter argument is, if you spend that dollar in information security, I can support patient care with that. So it's not a dollar lost, it's a dollar spent in total care. And it makes sense, right? This is the crew of the Space Shuttle Columbia, which is probably a good place for me to end. So thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, thank you for your time. Thank you. If you're interested in talking about this or other kinds of activities like that, please hit me up. I'm always available. Here's my contact information again if you missed it. I'm always willing to have a discussion regardless of what it is. So please hit me up. There I am. Thank you.